Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I'm a career army guy, been serving for about 12 years now. I'd saved up enough to buy my first house in this decent neighborhood with a homeowners association. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone voluntarily sign up for an HOA? Well, the house was perfect, the price was right, and I figured how bad could it be? The neighborhood was pretty typical suburban stuff. Nice lawns, decent people, and an HOA that seemed to just handle the basic maintenance of common areas. I paid my dues on time, kept my grass cut, and never had any issues. Everything was smooth sailing until I got my deployment orders. I was heading overseas for what was supposed to be a standard 12-month deployment. Before I left, I made sure everything was squared away. I set up automatic payments for all my bills, including the HOA dues. My neighbor agreed to keep an eye on the place, and I had a lawn service scheduled to come by every 2 weeks. I thought I had covered all my bases. The deployment was rough, we were stationed in a pretty active area, and there wasn't much downtime. Between the heat, the constant alerts, and just trying to stay alive, the last thing on my mind was what was happening back home. I trusted that everything was running smoothly. About 6 months into my deployment, my neighbor tried calling me, but communications were spotty where we were. I managed to catch a brief message saying something about the HOA in my house, but the connection cut out before I could get details. I tried calling back several times over the next few weeks, but couldn't get through. I figured it was probably some minor issue, maybe they wanted me to trim a tree or something. I asked my buddy who was handling my mail to check if there were any letters from the HOA, but he said everything looked normal. My automatic payments were still going through, so I didn't think much of it. When my deployment ended, and I finally made it back to the States, I was exhausted but excited to get home. The flight seemed to take forever, and all I could think about was sleeping in my own bed and maybe grilling a burger in my backyard. I pulled into my driveway around noon on a Tuesday, and immediately something felt wrong. There was a different car in the driveway, and the front yard looked different, not bad different, just not how I left it. I walked up to my front door and tried my key. It didn't work. I stood there for a minute thinking maybe I was just tired and using the wrong key. Then I heard footsteps inside. Someone was in my house. I knocked on the door, and after a few minutes, this middle-aged guy opened it. He asked if he could help me, looking confused. I told him this was my house and asked who he was. The guy looked at me like I was crazy and said he thought I was confused. He explained that he had bought the house 6 months ago. I told him that was impossible because I'd been deployed, but this was definitely my house, and I had the deed to prove it. The guy then explained that he had bought the house fair and square from the HOA, and they had told him the previous owner had abandoned it. That's when it hit me. The HOA had somehow sold my house while I was overseas. My head started spinning and I could feel my anger rising, but I kept my cool. I asked to see some paperwork because this had to be a mistake. The guy, who turned out to be pretty decent, showed me the sales documents. Sure enough, the HOA had declared my property abandoned and sold it at auction. The crazy part? I had been current on all my dues the entire time. I immediately drove to the HOA office. The property management company was in this little strip mall about 10 minutes away. I walked in and told the receptionist I needed to speak with someone about my house. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when I explained the situation and said she would get the property manager for me. A few minutes later, this woman in her 50s came out. I could tell from her expression that she knew exactly who I was. She said I must be the soldier and claimed they had tried to contact me multiple times. I explained that I had been deployed overseas and had set up automatic payments for my dues, which had been going through the entire time. The property manager said there were other violations, the grass had gotten too long, and there were some maintenance issues. I told her I had hired a lawn service and asked what maintenance issues she was talking about. She said she would have to check the file and disappeared for about 20 minutes before coming back with a thin folder. She handed me the paperwork they had on file. I looked through it, and it was all garbage. There were photos of my grass that was maybe an inch longer than their standards, a complaint about a loose gutter that I'd never seen before, and notices that had been sent to my address while I was literally on the other side of the world. I pointed out that these violations were minor at best, and I had been deployed. I asked if they didn't have any protections for military personnel. The property manager just said they followed all applicable laws. That's when I knew they were full of it. I asked for copies of everything and left. That night, I called the base legal office and spoke with the Judge Advocate General's office. The lawyer I talked to was furious when I explained what happened. He told me this was a clear violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, among other things, and they were going to sort it out. 2 days later, the JAG office sent a formal letter to the HOA demanding the immediate return of my property and threatening legal action. A week went by with no response. The JAG office called me and told me the HOA wasn't responding, so they were taking this to federal court. The lawsuit took about 4 months to work its way through the system. During that time, I had to stay in temporary lodging on base because I literally had nowhere else to go. The whole situation was insane. When we finally got to court, the HOA brought some hotshot lawyer who clearly thought this was going to be easy money. He had no idea what he was walking into. Our lawyer laid out the case methodically: the Service Members Civil Relief Act, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, multiple constitutional violations. By the time he was done, the HOA had violated 11 different federal laws. The judge was not happy. He asked the HOA to help him understand how they had seized and sold the home of an active duty service member who was current on all payments and deployed overseas in service to his country. The HOA lawyer started to explain that there were property maintenance violations, but the judge cut him off. The judge asked directly if they were aware this individual was on active military deployment. The lawyer looked back at the HOA board members sitting in the gallery. I could see them whispering frantically. He admitted they were aware of my deployment status. The judge's face went dark when he asked how they had proceeded anyway. What followed was one of the most satisfying 20 minutes of my life. The judge systematically destroyed every argument the HOA made. When it was over, he awarded me $1,500,000 in damages and ordered the immediate return of my property. The judge made it clear that if the property could not be returned to its exact previous condition, this matter would be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The guy who had bought my house was actually pretty cool about the whole thing. He understood he was an innocent victim and worked with us to unwind the sale. The HOA had to buy him another house and pay all his moving expenses on top of everything else. Here's the satisfying part: the judge didn't stop there. He ordered a full investigation into the HOA's practices and ultimately dissolved the entire organization. Turns out my case wasn't isolated. They had been pulling similar stunts on other people, just nobody with access to military legal resources had called them on it. 3 of the board members ended up facing federal charges. Karen, the HOA president who had signed off on selling my house, got 2 years in federal prison. The property management company lost their license and went out of business. I got my house back, got a nice check that set me up pretty well for the future, and the neighborhood is actually a much better place to live now without the HOA constantly harassing people about ridiculous violations. I had a half-brother, but we lived completely different lives. My dad had him when he was really young, and when I came along 25 years later, Dad was in his late 40s and ready to do things differently. My brother lived across the country with his mom after their messy divorce, and while Dad kept in touch, he wasn't really part of his day-to-day life. Dad and I were close though, really close. We went shooting at the range together almost every weekend. He taught me everything about guns, how to hold them, clean them, load them safely. He even gave me my first pistol when I turned 21. Those were some of my best memories with him. When Dad got cancer, it was brutal. He fought for months before he finally passed in October. I was devastated, but also grateful that his suffering was over. A few days before he died, he told me something that still sticks with me. He said when I was born, he didn't want to make the same mistakes he made with my brother. He He wanted to devote all his time to raising me right. My brother drove down for the funeral. We hadn't seen each other much over the years, but grief has a way of bringing family together. Since he was listed as the alternate on Dad's storage unit, we went together to clear it out. Then we headed to Dad's house to go through everything else. That's when I got my first shock. Dad had way more guns than I remembered. Boxes and cases full of rifles, pistols, and shotguns I'd never seen before. I was confused because Dad and I spent so much time at the range together. I told him how surprised I was at all the guns Dad had that I'd never seen before. My brother said Dad had been collecting them over the years and that we needed to talk about splitting everything up. I suggested we go 50-50 on everything, including the cars, tools, personal belongings, and guns. That's when my brother stopped me and said something that shocked me. He claimed Dad didn't want me to have the guns right away because he said I was too young. I stared at him. Too young? I was 25 years old and Dad had already given me a gun years ago. I told him that didn't make sense since Dad had given me a pistol when I was 21, and we went shooting together all the time. My brother insisted that's what Dad told him, and that I wasn't ready for that responsibility yet. I asked him what age I would be ready and why he needed 20 guns anyway. He was being really vague and said we would talk about it later. But we never did talk about it later. The next morning I woke up to the sound of him loading boxes into his truck. All the guns were going with him. I asked him what was going on since I thought he was staying another day to help with funeral arrangements. He said he needed to get back to his family because he had to work. When I brought up the guns again, he repeated that I wasn't ready, and maybe in a few years I could have some. He drove off that morning, leaving me to handle the funeral arrangements alone. I was hurt and confused, but I was also grieving and didn't have the energy to fight about it. A whole year passed. I got engaged to the love of my life, and we moved into a townhouse together. I was excited about this new chapter and decided to video call my brother to show him our new place. My brother seemed genuinely happy for me and said Dad would be so proud if he could see me now. That's when I decided to bring up the inheritance again. I told him that since I was getting married and had my own place now, I was wondering about those guns he took because protection was really important to me now. His response was cold. He told me to just let it go because they were gone. I asked him what he meant by gone, but he just hung up on me. A few days later, I texted him asking for closure and just wanting to know what happened. His response was a long message that accused me of being manipulative and greedy. He went on about how I had nice things like a $28,000 truck and a $16,000 motorcycle, saying I was spoiled and didn't need anything else. He lectured me about being selfish and said he would be hard on me like a father. He bragged about not having expensive things and said he was focused on his kids growing up to be productive. I took time to think about his message and wrote back a long response. I apologized if I seemed manipulative and explained that I wasn't coming from greed. I told him I just wanted closure as his brother and deserved to know what he did with items that held core memories between me and Dad. I asked if he sold them and said I would understand if he did it to feed his family. I explained that while it might seem like I was doing well, I had made lots of sacrifices to get where I was. My fiancée and I had drained nearly all our savings for the townhouse, her parents helped with furniture, and I was trying to sell the motorcycle to help with bills. I told him I was proud of my accomplishments and wanted to share them as his brother. I explained that protection was more important than ever now that I had someone to protect under my roof. I mentioned that some of those guns held special memories because Dad had taught me how to use specific ones, how to clean them, and how to handle them safely. I said it broke my heart when he left not knowing if I'd ever see those again. I even told him my fiancé offered to buy some back as Christmas gifts for me. I made it clear that if he had to sell them for his family, I understood, but I couldn't just let it go like he wanted. I told him I loved him and that he was the only brother I'd ever known, but I was putting my foot down because I couldn't pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. It's been a week since I sent that message and he still hasn't replied. Christmas is coming up and we're supposed to visit his family because I promised my nephews and niece I'd be there. The worst part is that I'm starting to piece together what really happened. Dad never said I was too young. My brother saw an opportunity when Dad died without a will and took everything valuable for himself. He probably sold most of those guns to help his finances, just like he sold Dad's tools and other belongings I later found out about. What makes me angriest is how he twisted it. He made himself sound like the responsible older brother protecting me from myself, when really, he was just being greedy. Those weren't just guns to me. They were the physical connection to all those weekends Dad and I spent together. They represented everything Dad taught me about responsibility and safety. My brother took advantage of my grief and the chaos after Dad's death. He knew I was too overwhelmed to fight him on it at the time. When I was in a place emotionally to deal with it, he'd already gotten rid of everything and made it clear he wasn't giving anything back. The thing that really gets me is his message about manipulation and greed. He's the one who manipulated the situation. He's the one who showed up, cleaned out everything valuable, and disappeared before I could object. Then he had the nerve to lecture me about being spoiled when he's the one who essentially stole my inheritance. I keep thinking about what Dad said before he died, about wanting to do better with me than he did with my brother. Maybe Dad saw something in my brother that I was too naive to see. Maybe that's why he was more involved in my life. Now I have to face him at Christmas and pretend everything is fine for the sake of the kids. But I won't forget what he did, and I won't let him gaslight me into thinking I was wrong for wanting what was rightfully mine. Some of those guns weren't just Dad's collection, they were our shared memories, and he had no right to take those away from me. My little brother, who was 12 at the time, had always been the family troublemaker. Not in a bad way, just in that typical annoying little brother way. He'd get into my stuff, mess with my things, and generally make my life a bit more complicated than it needed to be. But despite all that, we got along pretty well most of the time. The problems really started when I moved out for college. See, when I lived at home, I could keep an eye on my room and my stuff. If my brother took something, I'd usually notice pretty quickly and could get it back before any real damage was done. But once I was only home for holidays and breaks, things got out of hand fast. My brother had this habit of just taking whatever caught his eye from my room. Video games, books, clothes, electronics, nothing was safe. The worst part wasn't even that he took my stuff. It was that he never asked permission, he never returned things on his own, and he had zero respect for my belongings. I come home to find my favorite shirt stretched out or torn, my books with pages missing, or my games scratched up beyond repair. Every time I confronted him about it, he'd just shrug and act like it was no big deal. When I told him to ask before taking my stuff, he'd roll his eyes and say it was just sitting there anyway. My parents usually stayed out of it, saying we needed to work it out ourselves since we were both getting older. When Thanksgiving break rolled around during my freshman year, I came home excited to relax and catch up with everyone. But when I walked into my room, I could tell something was off. My desk looked different, my closet was messier than I'd left it, and several of my things were just gone. I did a quick inventory and realized my brother had taken my good winter jacket, a couple of books I've been reading, my portable gaming device, and even some of my nicer shirts. I was frustrated but tried to handle it maturely. I walked down the hall to his room and knocked on the door. When he didn't answer, I pushed it open and immediately spotted my missing stuff scattered around his room. My jacket was crumpled on his floor, my books were stacked haphazardly on his desk, and my shirts were mixed in with his laundry. When he got home from school that day, I decided to have a serious talk with him. I told him I needed to discuss something important, but he just asked what I wanted now with that annoyed tone he always used. I explained that I'd found my stuff in his room again and reminded him that we'd talked about this before. He just shrugged and said I wasn't even there most of the time anyway. I tried to explain that it didn't matter if I was home or not. These were still my things and he needed to respect that. He just gave me another dismissive response. I told him I was serious about this and that if he wanted to borrow something he should just call me and ask first. I said I'd probably say yes most of the time, but he needed to ask permission. He agreed in that fake way kids do when they just want the conversation to end. I also pointed out how he needed to take better care of my stuff, showing him how wrinkled and dirty my jacket had gotten. He just said it was only a jacket, like it didn't matter at all. I had to explain that it was my jacket, and I warned him clearly that if this kept happening, there would be payback. I asked if he understood, but he just shrugged and walked away, obviously not taking me seriously at all. Christmas break came around a few weeks later, and I was hopeful that maybe our conversation had gotten through to him. But when I got home and checked my room, I realized nothing had changed. If anything, it was worse this time. More clothes were missing, including some of my college gear that had sentimental value. My favorite hoodie was gone, along with several t-shirts and even some of my underwear. I found everything in his room again, and this time some of my shirts actually had stains on them. That's when I decided that talking wasn't working. The next morning my brother left for school like usual. My parents had already gone to work, so I had the house to myself. I went into his room and started carefully removing every single piece of clothing he owned. Shirts, pants, underwear, socks, pajamas, everything. I wasn't destructive about it or anything. I just took it all and hid it in the hall closet right outside his room. Then I waited. That evening everything was normal at first. We had dinner as a family, watched some TV, and my brother went upstairs to do homework. Around 8:30 I heard the shower turn on. Perfect timing. About 20 minutes later the shower turned off, and then I heard my brother moving around in his room. A few minutes of silence passed, and then suddenly I heard him yelling about where all his clothes were. I could hear him opening and closing drawers, checking his closet, looking under his bed. The panic in his voice was growing when he called for our parents, saying something was wrong with his room. My parents and I were sitting in the living room when he came thundering down the stairs, wearing nothing but a towel, his hair still dripping wet. He was freaking out, telling everyone that someone had stolen all his clothes and that everything was gone. He said his entire dresser was empty and started talking about how someone must have broken into our house. My mom asked what he meant by everything being gone, and he explained that he meant literally everything. All his shirts, pants, underwear, the whole works. My dad pointed out that it didn't make sense for someone to break in just to steal his clothes. I was sitting on the couch trying not to smile when my brother's eyes landed on me. I could see the realization dawning on his face when he accused me of doing this. I played dumb for a second, but then I admitted that, yeah, I had taken his clothes. He got really upset, demanding to know why I would do such a thing and ordering me to give them back immediately. I reminded him about the warning I'd given him about payback if he kept taking my stuff without asking. He argued that this was different and that I couldn't just take all his clothes. I asked him why not, pointing out that he'd been taking my clothes for months without asking, so I figured he wouldn't mind if I returned the favor. He protested that he needed clothes and couldn't go to school tomorrow with nothing to wear. I suggested that maybe he should have thought about that before he kept ignoring me when I asked him to stop taking my things. By this point, my brother was getting really worked up. He turned to our parents, clearly expecting them to take his side and force me to give his clothes back immediately. He complained to them that this wasn't fair and demanded they make me tell him where his clothes were. But instead of rushing to his defense, my parents were both trying really hard not to laugh. My dad had this huge grin on his face, and my mom was covering her mouth with her hand. My dad reminded my brother that I had warned him about this, and my mom pointed out that he had been taking my things without permission. My brother argued that what I did was way worse than what he had done, but I challenged him on that. I pointed out that he'd been doing this for months and had taken way more of my stuff over time than I had taken of his in one day. He insisted it was different, but when I asked how, he couldn't really explain it beyond saying it just was. I decided to offer him a deal. I told him I'd give him his clothes back that night, but only if he promised to ask before taking my stuff from now on. I also warned him that if he broke that promise, next time he'd have to find his clothes on his own. He quickly agreed to promise, clearly desperate to get his clothes back. I asked if he really meant it because I wasn't going to keep doing this every time I came home. He swore he really promised and begged me to tell him where his clothes were. I led him to the hall closet and opened it up. All of his clothes were there, neatly folded and organized. He grabbed an armful and ran back to his room to get dressed. The rest of my winter break was peaceful. My brother didn't take a single thing from my room without asking first. And when I came home for a spring break, all of my stuff was exactly where I'd left it. More importantly, he actually started calling me at college when he wanted to borrow something. Most of the time I said yes, and when I did, He took good care of whatever he borrowed and returned it right when I got home. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.